Every civilization believes it will last forever. The Romans carved their gods into marble. The British drew the world in red ink. And now, we etch our dreams into circuits and clouds, convinced that intelligence itself will keep us alive. But what if intelligence is the very thing that drives us insane? What if reason, refined, perfected, automated, eventually destroys the societies that worship it most? 12,000 years from now, in the heart of the galaxy, that question becomes prophecy. On the planet Trantor, the first Galactic Empire rules over millions of worlds. Every law, every trade, every whisper of power passes through this single city world. The streets never see the sky. The sun itself is buried under 1,000 layers of metal and ambition. The Empire has conquered every distance except time. Deep inside this planetary labyrinth, a man named Hari Seldon makes a prediction. He does not read omens nor stare into stars. He uses mathematics. Cold equations, numbers so vast they swallow the idea of free will, and those numbers tell him something terrifying. Civilization, no matter how vast, no matter how advanced, follows a pattern. Growth, stagnation, collapse. It's not a myth, it's a formula. Seldon's equations predict that the Galactic Empire, the greatest empire in human history, will fall, and that the fall will last 30,000 years. 30,000 years of war, darkness, and forgetting. Unless someone intervenes. Seldon's answer is called psychohistory, a lost science that can predict the behavior of entire civilizations, but not the madness of a single human being, a science that knows when we will go mad, but never why. And in that gap between knowledge and emotion, civilizations die. What if someone told you our world today could be mapped the same way? That social media, economics, even political rage all follow predictable equations of decay? Would you want to know how close we are to the next collapse? Because this story, of Trantor, of Seldon, of the Empire's fall, isn't only about the future. It's about us. If you're drawn to stories that make you question the fate of humanity, stay with this one. Because this is not just science fiction. It's a mirror, and what it reflects may be closer than you think. Trantor is a planet-sized city. From orbit, it shines like a polished coin. But look closer. The towers hide decay. Corridors rot beneath layers of progress. Bureaucracy spreads faster than light. Whole sectors exist only to manage other sectors. An empire of administrators, of memory, of maintenance. To keep the galaxy from falling apart, trillions of humans work like cells inside one living machine. They process numbers, enforce decrees, maintain order. But no one remembers why the machine exists. From the outer provinces to the imperial courts, faith in the system has replaced understanding of it. People don't believe in truth anymore. They believe in procedure. The Empire has become a religion of paperwork, and when a system grows too complex to understand, it becomes indistinguishable from madness. That's where Seldon comes in. He doesn't fight the madness. He studies it. He gathers data from 1 million worlds, population curves, trade ratios, historical records, and feeds them into a single mathematical vision. The equations reveal patterns invisible to any emperor. Wars don't begin because of one man's greed. Revolutions don't start because of one speech. They are the natural outcomes of hidden forces. Seldon calls it psychohistory, the mathematics of mass behavior. At first, the Empire laughs. Then it grows afraid, because if psychohistory works, it means freedom is an illusion. And if freedom is an illusion, so is power. Seldon is accused of treason, not for lying, but for telling the truth too early. He's given a choice, execution or exile. He chooses exile to a barren world at the edge of the galaxy called Terminus. There, under the guise of compiling an encyclopedia of all human knowledge, he builds something else, something that will outlast the Empire itself, but that's another chapter. For now, the capital still glitters. Trantor still breathes, and no one, except one mathematician and his secret followers, knows that history has already ended. If a civilization can go mad, does that mean it can be cured? If you could see the equation of your own downfall, would you still live the same way? That's what Hari Seldon asked himself. And it's what we should be asking now, because perhaps the real genius of psychohistory isn't that it predicts collapse. It's that it asks us whether we can choose not to follow the pattern. The first Galactic Empire did not begin with fire. It began with memory. After the long centuries of chaos that followed humanity's first expansion into the stars, a single truth emerged. Unity was survival. World by world, trade routes became alliances. Alliances became federations. Federations became one throne. At its height, the empire ruled 1,000,000 worlds. Every planet sent its tribute to the capital. Every culture, every science, every dream flowed through the veins of a single organism. To the people of Trantor, the empire seemed as permanent as gravity itself. They believed history had ended, but the equations of civilization are not linear. They are cyclical, beautiful, predictable, merciless. Every empire, from Earth's Rome to the galactic core, climbs the same curve. Expansion breeds wealth. Wealth breeds complacency. Complacency invites rot. The philosopher-scientists of Trantor once called it the law of entropy, applied to ambition. No energy, not even that of empires, lasts forever. The imperial records describe the city as a marvel. It stretched over the entire planet, its surface a mosaic of domes, towers, and spires. The true sky, if one could find it, was only a myth for the lower levels. Entire generations lived and died without ever seeing the sun. Every sector was devoted to something: administration, energy, archives, maintenance. 1,000,000,000 bureaucrats filed and refilled the same forms that kept the galaxy moving. But somewhere beneath the mechanical order, something had begun to tremble. The outer provinces stopped paying tribute. Pirates returned to the trade lanes. Local governors built private fleets for security purposes. At first, these were dismissed as anomalies, distant static at the edges of perfection. Yet decay begins not with rebellion, but with forgetting. The empire forgot why it ruled. It remembered only how. History always repeats, but it never repeats kindly. Consider Rome. The greatest city on earth once commanded an empire that wrapped around the Mediterranean like a golden bracelet. It fell not to barbarians, but to bureaucracy, indulgence, and exhaustion. Or Byzantium, beautiful, intricate, unkillable until it suddenly was. Or Britain, its sun never set until it did. Trantor was all of them at once. For 12,000 years, it had maintained the illusion of stability through momentum alone. Generations of emperors had been trained to maintain, not to imagine. Their thrones rested not on faith or conquest, but on habit. No, but habit can't hold a galaxy together. Hari Seldon's equations would later reveal that the empire's stability was already mathematically impossible. The data was irrefutable. The rate of bureaucratic expansion outpaced population growth. Cultural innovation had plateaued. Scientific breakthroughs declined each century. The empire had entered the flat line before the fall. It was still rich, still mighty, but only in appearance. Its wealth came from systems it no longer understood. Its peace was enforced by armies that no longer believed in the wars they fought, and so the empire did what all decaying powers do: it mistook longevity for immortality. Even now, as the imperial archives record new achievements every hour, each entry is a eulogy written before death, because when a civilization becomes too vast to feel, it becomes a corpse that doesn't know it's dead. But one man will learn to read that corpse like scripture. One man will see the geometry beneath the decay, and he will realize that even collapse has a pattern. Trantor is not a city. It's an equation made of metal. The smell of recycled air hangs everywhere, slightly sterile, slightly electric. The sound of transit tubes runs through the walls like veins. People move in perfect rhythm, but their eyes are tired. They look like functions in someone else's algorithm, a planet of order. And yet, the closer one looks, the more chaotic it becomes. A senator rides a mag-rail capsule to the Imperial Dome, rehearsing speeches no one will hear. A clerk updates taxation quotas for systems already in revolt. A maintenance engineer, deep beneath the surface, watches a reactor pulse erratically, then chooses not to report it. The machine runs. The machine always runs, until it doesn't. In the upper districts, Trantor gleams like a myth. Artificial daylight cycles over glass and gold. Gardens bloom under force fields. But those gardens are grown from synthetic soil. The trees have no roots. The Empire has forgotten what real nature feels like. A philosopher once said, "A civilization begins to die when it replaces memory with simulation." Trantor lives in simulation. Its citizens simulate purpose. Its emperors simulate command. And when meaning becomes an act, the act itself becomes sacred. You can hear it in the city's rhythm, the pulse of something both beautiful and deranged. It's the same sound that filled Rome before its fall. The same calm that surrounded Wall Street before its crash. Our world today knows that sound too. We think our systems, economic, digital, political, are self-sustaining. But every system depends on a fragile illusion that it will always repair itself faster than it decays. History suggests otherwise. Even in our own time, the data curves are eerily familiar. Information overload, political division, collapse of trust, centralization of power, loss of shared meaning. It's psychohistory without the math, only instinct, only dread. We may not have Trantor's towers, but we have its mindset. When Hari Seldon walks these streets for the first time, he feels it before he proves it. He watches a crowd of citizens moving in perfect formation across the transit concourse, each following invisible signals. The sight is mesmerizing, like watching gravity perform ballet. But beneath the harmony, he senses instability. He begins to imagine a mathematics that can explain this dance. The momentum of belief, the decay of cooperation, the tipping point where structure becomes chaos. He is not the first to wonder if the fate of civilizations can be graphed, but he will be the first to prove that it can. The math is simple at first. Population curves, resource depletion, probability distributions, then complexity rises. Seldon adds psychology, communication theory, cultural feedback. He realizes that human civilization behaves like a thermodynamic system. Every decision adds entropy. Every lie increases pressure. And when entropy reaches a threshold, collapse is no longer a risk. It's a certainty. That certainty terrifies him. Because if the curve of decay is predictable, then so is the madness that follows. Civilizations don't die peacefully. They panic, rage, fragment. They invent new gods, new lies, new wars to explain what the numbers already predicted. Trantor, for all its brilliance, is already in that early phase of madness. Seldon can feel it in the air, the quiet desperation of a species that built heaven, and now fears what comes after. He writes one line in his notes: "Perhaps the only thing more dangerous than chaos is the illusion of control." A clerk named Dara sits in Archive Sector 8, surrounded by data cubes. She files records of planetary tax shipments, numbers that no longer correspond to real cargo. She knows it. Everyone knows it, but the system demands completion, not truth. Every night, she dreams of silence, of a world without paperwork, without forms, without orders, from worlds she'll never see. Somewhere above her, a young senator rehearses a speech for the Imperial Council. His words are elegant, hollow. He knows no one listens, yet he delivers them anyway because his father did and his father's father before him. In another district, a child in the maintenance levels hears a reactor hum differently. She tells her mother. Her mother tells her to forget it. The Empire knows what it's doing. And far away, Hari Seldon walks through the Imperial Library. a cathedral of light and data that stores every human idea. It feels like walking through eternity. But even here, he senses decay. Some archives haven't been updated in centuries. Others have been overwritten, corrupted, or forgotten. Knowledge itself is dying of bureaucracy. Seldon runs his first models in secret. They confirm his fear. The probability of total collapse within 5 centuries, 99.92%. The data doesn't lie. He looks up at the imperial dome where statues of past emperors stand in perfect silence. They were all certain of their immortality, and he realizes that immortality is just a slower form of death. He begins to share his findings with a few trusted students. Their reactions vary: wonder, horror, disbelief. One asks him, "If you can predict collapse, can you stop it?" Seldon doesn't answer. Not yet, because he already knows the answer. No civilization has ever escaped its own equations, but perhaps it can rewrite them. Inside, a new equation takes shape. It will one day be called the Seldon Plan, and it will change the fate of the galaxy. But before that, the Empire must fall. Psychohistory began as a whisper in the halls of the University of Streeling. Hari Seldon arrived there not as a prophet, but as a mathematician looking for order in chaos. He believed the galaxy could be explained like a wave function. Every action, every rebellion, every triumph, just part of a greater curve. At first, the Empire barely noticed him. The capital teemed with thinkers who specialized in abstractions that led nowhere. But Seldon's ideas were different. They implied something the Empire could not allow: inevitability. He proposed that human behavior, in large enough numbers, obeys the same statistical laws as particles in a gas. You can't predict the motion of a single atom, but you can predict the pressure, the temperature, the flow of millions. Apply that to humanity, and you can see the future. The idea spread through academic circles like a forbidden current. Some called it genius, others called it blasphemy. Because if Seldon was right, free will was a myth. Even worse, so was the Emperor's divine authority. By the time Seldon presented his first formal model to the Imperial Science Council, his reputation had split the intellectual world in two. Traditionalists argued that civilization was guided by morality and leadership. Seldon countered that morality and leadership were just variables, temporary, predictable, doomed to regression. He didn't see himself as a rebel. He saw himself as a physician diagnosing a disease no one else could see. Seldon's equations began to model not just population growth, but ideology. He found that belief systems, once reaching saturation, collapse under their own weight. He mapped the cycles of corruption and reform in microcosm, from city governments to planetary coalitions, and proved that the same equations governed all scales. A civilization, he concluded, behaves like a living organism. It grows, matures, and decays according to measurable constants. It was the closest thing to immortality science had ever found, and it promised only death. The Emperor, Cleon II, summoned Seldon to the imperial court. Historians would later romanticize that meeting, but the records are clear. Seldon didn't go to preach revolution. He went to explain mathematics. He spoke of entropy, population density, and economic drift. The Emperor heard only prophecy. Within hours, the Empire's elite labeled him dangerous. The military saw him as a threat to morale. The priests saw him as a heretic. And yet, a few visionaries, scholars, statisticians, bureaucrats disillusioned with the system, quietly reached out. They wanted to see the data. The project grew in secret. Students filled hidden labs, building simulations that modeled entire sectors of the galaxy. Trillions of data points, centuries of history compressed into equations. The results were undeniable. Collapse within 500 years, followed by 30 millennia of chaos. But buried in the noise, a second pattern emerged, an escape route. If knowledge could be preserved, if a seed of science and culture could survive, the Dark Age could be shortened to just 1,000 years. That was the beginning of the plan. But a plan that predicts the fall of the Empire cannot stay secret forever. The Imperial Commission began investigating Seldon's circle. Arrests followed, and on the eve of his trial for treason, Seldon made his boldest prediction yet. The Empire would not destroy him. It would need him, because even emperors fear the mathematics of fate. Trantor never sleeps, but the university dreams. Inside its towers, minds burn with restless precision. The air smells faintly of ozone and paper, synthetic ink drying on endless pages. Here, thought is worship. Yet even worship decays. Seldon stands before a blackboard that stretches from floor to ceiling, its surface alive with symbols. Every equation feels like a star in a galaxy only he can see. Each connection is a gravitational pull between ideas. He knows that if his math is correct, it will not merely describe the future, it will rewrite humanity's relationship with it. He doesn't answer. Because the truth is worse. Numbers don't decide, they reveal. Psychohistory is not prophecy. It's probability. It doesn't predict individuals, only masses. It cannot tell who will start a war, but it can tell that one will begin, and when. That limitation is its mercy and its curse. Seldon often walked alone through the data archives, lost among ancient maps and forgotten treaties. He liked to listen to the silence of history, the faint hum of recorded centuries. It made him feel small, but not insignificant. He once wrote, "To understand humanity, one must step outside it. Only then can you see its shape." That's what psychohistory does. It steps outside time, but the further he steps, the colder the view becomes. In the equations, empathy disappears. Compassion becomes noise. Individuals are reduced to vectors of probability. He worries that by understanding civilization so well, he's stopped being part of it. It's the philosopher's nightmare and the scientist's burden. There's a parallel here, one we feel today. We build algorithms that predict what people will buy, what they'll think, even who they'll love. We use data to shape behavior before it happens. Our machines can already anticipate the collapse of markets, the spread of misinformation, the pulse of public rage. We are building our own version of psychohistory, without calling it that. And like the Empire, we tell ourselves it's progress, but progress without humility becomes prophecy without mercy. Seldon's students notice the toll it's taking on him. His lectures grow quieter, his eyes more distant. One asks him, "Do you believe the plan can save us?" He smiles faintly. "It can save civilization," he says, "not us." That answer chills the room, because if psychohistory works, their lives are only calculations feeding a greater design. They are not heroes. They are variables. That night, Seldon writes a note to himself. If the Empire is a body, the plan must be surgery. Surgery without anesthesia. For the first time, he wonders whether knowledge can ever be moral. The hall is vast, silent, absurdly bright. Statues of past emperors rise on every side, frozen echoes of power. Seldon walks slowly, a thin man surrounded by soldiers in gold armor. The charge, treason by prediction. He is ordered to explain himself before the Emperor's Science Council and the High Minister of Information. "You claim to foresee the fall of the Empire?" "I claim nothing," Seldon answers. "The numbers do." Laughter ripples through the court. The minister steps closer. "If what you say is true, then the Empire has no future. You undermine hope itself." Seldon meets his gaze. Hope built on ignorance is already lost. It's that line, quiet, almost gentle, that seals his fate. The court adjourns. The sentence is prepared. Execution by exile. But before the verdict is carried out, the emperor himself intervenes. Cleon II, the man who believes his dynasty will last another 1,000 years, summons Seldon privately. The conversation is recorded nowhere, but later fragments, scribes' whispers, notes, recovered surveillance, suggest its tone. The emperor wanted reassurance. He didn't fear collapse. He feared irrelevance. Seldon tells him the truth. You cannot stop the fall, but you can shape what comes after. That's when he offers his bargain. Let him build a colony at the edge of the galaxy. Let him compile an Encyclopedia Galactica to preserve all human knowledge. Let him act, publicly, as a loyal scholar serving posterity. Privately, he will build something else, a refuge for the future. Cleon agrees, not out of wisdom, but vanity. He likes the idea of an empire so eternal it needs an encyclopedia. And so Seldon and his followers are exiled, not as prisoners, but as librarians. They are given ships, supplies, and a world few have heard of. Terminus. As the ships depart Trantor, the city glows beneath them like a dying star. Billions below continue their routines, unaware that their fate has already been written. In the observation bay, Seldon watches the planet shrink. His student, Dors, stands beside him. "Do you think they'll ever believe you were right?" He shakes his head. "They don't need to. The future will." The ships vanish into the dark. Behind them lies an empire that still believes it will last forever. Ahead of them lies a barren world, and the greatest experiment in history. But even Seldon doesn't know the truth yet. The mathematics can predict collapse. It cannot predict the mutation that will one day break the plan. The fall had not yet come, but Hari Seldon could already hear its echo. Not in the streets of Trantor, not in the endless murmur of bureaucrats, but in the data, numbers bending toward catastrophe. He had spent his life tracing the motion of crowds the way astronomers charted stars, and what he found was not random. Human civilization, at scale, moved with frightening predictability. Every rise, every collapse, every empire that thought itself eternal followed the same hidden curve, the mathematics of destiny. When he first mapped the probabilities, he thought he had made a mistake. The equations suggested something absurd, that the Galactic Empire, 12,000 years old, would die within centuries, that its decay was irreversible, and that nothing, no law, no army, no emperor, could stop it. But the numbers never lied. Only people did. The idea of psychohistory spread quietly through the academic halls of Streeling University. Whispers of a man who could see the future, not as prophecy but as proof. Yet what terrified the emperor wasn't that Seldon claimed the empire would fall. It was that his math could prove it. Seldon was summoned to the imperial palace through levels of security so vast that even the corridors hummed with the nervous energy of men who feared irrelevance. Cleon I, the cloned emperor, asked him the question every ruler fears: can the empire be saved? Seldon didn't flinch. No, but it can be prepared. That sentence would change the fate of a galaxy. For Seldon's plan was not about saving the empire. It was about saving civilization from the chaos that would follow. Without intervention, 30,000 years of darkness awaited. But if his plan succeeded, if he could manipulate human behavior at a civilizational scale, the Dark Age could be reduced to just 1,000. Imagine that, 30 millennia of barbarism traded for one. The price, a single generation's obedience to a science no one truly understood. His proposal seemed heretical. To predict human destiny was one thing, to shape it was another, but he had the numbers, the models, and the chilling logic of inevitability. The empire didn't imprison him, at least not yet. Instead, they gave him an offer: continue his research under surveillance, away from Trantor's political center. They pretended it was generosity. Seldon understood it was exile in disguise. So the Foundation was born, on Terminus, the most remote planet at the edge of the galaxy. Officially, it was a project to compile the Encyclopedia Galactica, a record of all human knowledge. Unofficially, it was the seed of a new civilization, planted in the ashes of the old. But the brilliance of Seldon's design was its concealment. Few even within the Foundation knew its true purpose. To them, it was merely academic work. To Seldon, it was the beginning of humanity's survival algorithm. The Empire didn't realize that it had become part of the experiment. Its decline would unfold exactly as predicted: corruption, fragmentation, rebellion, and the Foundation would rise in the ruins, guided by the echoes of a dead man's mathematics. Because psychohistory wasn't about foresight, it was about inevitability. Every crisis was mapped, every choice anticipated, every deviation corrected through what Seldon called crisis points, moments when only one path forward could sustain the plan. At those junctures, history would funnel itself into the correct future. The Foundation would face each one, believing it was improvising, unaware they were acting out a script written centuries before. It was destiny disguised as free will, and that is what made it terrifying. Think about it. What would it mean to live inside a plan so vast you couldn't see its edges? To make choices that were already calculated? To fight wars, love people, lose them, and have it all be part of a model? That's not prophecy, that's programming. In this moment, on Trantor's steel plains, as Seldon walked beneath the artificial sky of the imperial capital, the scope of what he'd done began to dawn on him. He wasn't predicting humanity's story, he was writing it. And for the first time, he wondered if the plan itself might be the very thing that destroys the future it seeks to save, because no plan survives contact with chaos. He knew something his followers did not. Psychohistory could not predict individuals. It could only predict masses, and sometimes one mind, one anomaly, could throw the entire system into disarray. He didn't know the name yet, but one day, history would call him the Mule. Trantor never slept. It didn't know how. Even at artificial midnight, the planet's surface glowed, a metallic ocean lit by the pulse of billions. From orbit, it looked alive, like a neuron firing inside a galactic brain. Somewhere deep within that hive of circuits and corridors, Hari Seldon walked alone. The air tasted of sterilized metal and filtered oxygen. Below him, entire continents of machinery kept the planet breathing. Each level of the city had its own weather, its own gravity adjustments, its own quiet despair. The upper towers shimmered with bureaucratic perfection. The lower levels drowned in the hum of forgotten engines and recycled air. It was in this silence, broken only by the distant thunder of transport tubes, that Seldon did his thinking. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most advanced civilization in human history, so sprawling that sunlight never touched its true surface, was already rotting from within. And his math, his beloved psychohistory, could measure the decay like a heartbeat before cardiac arrest. He would stand on balconies and imagine the equations as invisible threads running through the crowds below, each person a data point, each decision a ripple. Alone, they were random. Together, they formed patterns, predictable, repetitive, cruel. Was it arrogance to quantify human fate, or mercy? Psychohistory was born from compassion as much as intellect. Seldon wasn't a tyrant, he was a witness. He saw what others couldn't, that civilizations behaved like living organisms. They grew, matured, stagnated, and eventually died. The empire's pulse had slowed centuries ago, but its people were too proud to notice. Yet the deeper his models grew, the more disturbing the implications became. He could predict rebellions before they began, revolutions that hadn't yet been imagined, economic collapses centuries in the future. To the emperor, that kind of foresight was power. To Seldon, it was a warning. And that warning wasn't meant just for the empire, it was for us. We like to believe our world today is different, that our technology, our democracies, our instant communication make us immune to history's cycles. But the math of decline is stubborn. Look around. Economic bubbles expanding beyond reason, political systems fracturing under their own weight, faith in institutions eroding like rust. If psychohistory existed now, it would see our data the way Seldon saw Trantor's. It would plot our tweets, our elections, our market fluctuations, and find the same rhythm, rising, falling, rising again. Civilizations don't collapse from a single blow. They decay from the inside out, one complacent generation at a time. Trantor was not ancient when it began to fall. It was magnificent. That's what made its downfall inevitable. Seldon often quoted a proverb from old Earth. When the gods wish to destroy us, they first give us everything we desire. He knew psychohistory was not a tool of control. It was a mirror. It showed humanity what it truly was: predictable in crowds, irrational in solitude, brilliant and blind in equal measure. Sometimes at night, Seldon would close his eyes and imagine the noise of the city fading away. In that silence, he could almost hear the sound of the galaxy breathing, the heartbeat of billions, synchronized through the invisible pulse of mathematics. He dreamed of two lights at opposite ends of the galaxy, two seeds in the darkness, the foundations. The first would preserve knowledge through science, technology, and reason. The second, hidden, would preserve something far more fragile, the human mind itself. Together, they would form a bridge across the coming dark. But even he couldn't silence the question that haunted him. If humanity's future is a calculation, where does the soul fit in? The more his equations succeeded, the more he doubted them. Because psychohistory, for all its precision, left no space for love, for art, for choice. It could model the birth and death of empires, but not the trembling of a hand reaching for another in the dark. And yet, those small moments were the cracks through which history sometimes escaped. Perhaps, he thought, the plan's greatest danger wasn't chaos, but certainty. Because when a civilization believes it knows its destiny, it stops questioning. It stops growing. He looked at the Empire's archives, endless rows of recorded data, the same facts written 1,000 different ways, and felt an ancient chill. The Empire wasn't dying of violence, it was dying of repetition. When innovation becomes ritual, when curiosity becomes bureaucracy, collapse is not a failure. It's evolution demanding a reset. Seldon wondered if his plan, his sacred numbers, might simply be another layer of control, another way for humanity to avoid confronting its own nature. He had once believed that if he could see the future clearly enough, he could save it. But the longer he stared into his models, the more he realized the future was staring back. Because psychohistory wasn't about predicting behavior, it was about revealing truth, the truth that civilizations go mad long before they fall. It begins in the small things, the rewriting of history to flatter the present, the fear of new ideas, the worship of stability. By the time an empire realizes it's sick, it has already forgotten what health felt like. In that sense, psychohistory wasn't a cure. It was a diagnosis. Trantor's glittering towers were still full of light, but its spirit had already dimmed. The emperor still ruled, but power had quietly moved elsewhere. To the mathematician, no one fully understood. And Seldon, in the loneliness of his genius, began to suspect that his greatest creation might one day need protection not from chaos, but from humanity itself. Because when knowledge becomes power, power always tries to own it. And when the plan finally began, no one, not even Hari Seldon, would control it anymore. The machine of destiny had started turning. They called it the Encyclopedia Project. On paper, it was harmless. A grand archive of human knowledge, a noble effort to preserve science, art, and history before they were lost to the entropy of time. But beneath the scholarly tone of its manifestos, something else was happening. On the far edge of the galaxy, the Foundation took root on Terminus, a cold, wind-beaten world with no natural resources and no military importance, the perfect hiding place for destiny. No one there fully understood the purpose. Not yet. In the early days, life on Terminus was almost primitive. Ships arrived from Trantor filled with scientists, historians, and engineers. They were scholars, not settlers. They had been told this was a project of peace, but when the first storms hit and the power grids flickered, they realized they were very far from the heart of the Empire. Dr. Gall Dornick still remembered his first night on the planet. He had left Trantor, a place where stars were hidden by the roofs of civilization, and stood under an open sky for the first time. The silence frightened him. On Trantor, silence meant absence. On Terminus, it meant infinity. He had believed in Hari Seldon completely. Psychohistory had been his religion, his rebellion against meaninglessness. But as he watched the horizon, black mountains rising over a sea of dust, he began to wonder if belief was enough. They had left behind the center of everything to live on the edge of nothing. Every evening the scholars gathered in makeshift halls, illuminated by flickering plasma lamps. They argued about everything: how to organize their data, what knowledge should be preserved, who would lead. But under the noise of debate, something unspoken bound them together: fear. They were scientists trying to survive on faith. The Empire still sent supply ships then. The bureaucrats on Trantor dismissed the Foundation as an eccentric experiment, but Seldon had designed it that way. The less attention they drew, the safer they were. He had planned even their irrelevance. And still, the people on Terminus dreamed of home. There was Lathan Devers, a technician who'd once worked on Trantor's sub-ether communications grid. He used to fix the voices of senators and admirals. Now he spent his days building antennas from scrap. "Back there," he once said, "you could live your whole life without seeing the sky. Here, the sky sees everything." There was Pirenne, the bureaucrat who refused to let go of titles. He still wore the insignia of the Empire's science ministry, as if a badge could shield him from the truth. "The Emperor will send more resources," he told his colleagues. "We're still part of the core." But each year the shipments came later, smaller or not at all. And there was Salvor Hardin, the one who saw the truth early, a man born without illusions. While the others built archives, he watched the stars and took notes on which nearby systems had begun to turn hostile. "Violence," he said quietly, "is the last refuge of the incompetent." He understood something that the others didn't. The Foundation would not survive as scholars. It would survive as survivors. Years passed. The holograms of Seldon, the pre-recorded messages stored in the time vault, appeared exactly when his equations predicted. He would materialize in light and calmly explain that a crisis was approaching, one that only a specific path could solve. It was eerie, as if time itself had conspired to keep them in line. The first Seldon crisis arrived when the surrounding kingdoms, the fragments of the crumbling empire, began to threaten Terminus. The Foundation had no weapons, no armies, no fleet, but it had something more powerful: knowledge. They turned science into religion. They disguised nuclear technology as divine magic, creating a church of the galactic spirit to control the barbaric worlds around them. Priests, not soldiers, spread their influence. The Foundation survived, not through conquest, but by turning belief into strategy. And all of it had been planned centuries before. Still, there were whispers. Doubts. What if the plan failed? What if the holograms stopped appearing? What if psychohistory had limits? Baita Durrell once wrote in her journal, "We live as if the future is a story already written." But what if someone changes the ending? Even Hari Seldon had wondered that in his final days on Trantor. Before the Empire's secret police came for him, he recorded one last message, hidden deep within the vault's archives. It was never meant to be played early, but time, like history, has its own sense of irony. The message began with a pause. Seldon's hologram blinked once, as if aware of its own ghostly existence. "Psychohistory," he said, "cannot predict the random motion of a single atom. And yet, from the chaos of atoms, the structure of stars emerges. So it is with humanity. But remember, if a single anomaly grows strong enough, it can warp the entire pattern." Then he looked up, eyes distant, almost fearful. "If that anomaly ever appears, the plan will not hold." No one knew what he meant. Not then, but decades later, when a single man rose from the forgotten edge of the galaxy, one who could twist emotion itself, bending loyalty and love to his will, the name, the Mule, began to echo through the stars. And suddenly, psychohistory, the science of destiny, met its first and greatest threat. The plan began to tremble, because numbers cannot predict madness, and civilization's next test would not come from chaos outside the plan, but from the heart that beat against it. By the time the first Foundation began to rise, Trantor was already fading into myth. The core world still clung to the illusion of control, but the outlying systems had stopped listening. In the quiet void between stars, a new center of power was forming, a colony built on the skeleton of Seldon's plan. Terminus had become more than a scientific outpost. It was the embryo of a civilization. Its libraries grew into universities, its scholars into politicians, its debates into doctrine. The Foundation no longer existed merely to preserve knowledge, it existed to use it. And yet, the people of Terminus still lived in the shadow of a ghost. Hari Seldon had been dead for centuries, but his plan lived on, encoded in the logic of survival. Every decision, every conflict, every victory seemed to unfold according to his long-dead equations. It began with trade. When the first outer kingdoms fell into barbarism, the Foundation sent traders, men who carried portable nuclear devices disguised as sacred relics. On planets where superstition ruled, the traders' tools were indistinguishable from miracles. The Foundation's priests maintained these relics, ensuring obedience not through war but through worship. Entire worlds bent their knees to technology they could no longer understand. And in that obedience, the Foundation discovered something more powerful than armies: dependence. It was a subtle empire, one built not from conquest but from contracts. The Foundation supplied power, medicine, and communication to the outer systems, and in return, those systems surrendered their autonomy. Not because they were forced to, but because they could no longer live without the miracles of the Foundation. The plan had predicted this perfectly. Science had become religion. Faith had become infrastructure. At first, this theocracy seemed benign. The outer worlds worshipped the galactic spirit, never realizing it was simply the logic of applied physics. The priests of Terminus preached order and peace, but behind their sermons lay the cold calculus of psychohistory. Salvor Hardin, the first great mayor of Terminus, understood this balance better than anyone. He wasn't a scientist, he was a strategist. Where others saw the plan as divine prophecy, he saw it as a weapon. Violence, he had said long ago, is the last refuge of the incompetent. And he meant it. When the Four Kingdoms threatened invasion, Hardin didn't raise an army. He raised belief. The invaders were paralyzed by their own faith. How could they attack the keepers of divine power? When their sacred devices failed, the priests turned to Terminus for repair. Hardin had them where he wanted them, not by force, but by design. The First Foundation's first victory came not from war, but from psychology. It was the first proof that Seldon's plan was working. Decades later, new crises arose. The priesthood began to fracture, and science demanded its freedom from superstition. Theocracy gave way to trade. A new generation of leaders emerged, merchant princes who ruled not by scripture, but by commerce. Among them was Hober Mallow, the first true merchant prince of the Foundation. He transformed the galaxy's faith into economy. Mallow understood what Hardin had only glimpsed. Belief could be monetized. The Foundation's nuclear devices became luxury goods, its knowledge a form of currency. Where priests once spread the gospel of science, merchants now spread the promise of profit. And once again, the galaxy bent its knee, not to gods this time, but to markets. Through trade monopolies and technological control, the Foundation's influence reached farther than any emperor's decree. It began to function as the very empire it had once feared to replace. The irony was almost poetic. To escape the ruins of one empire, humanity had built another, more efficient, more cunning, and just as blind. Because every system of power, no matter how rational, eventually forgets why it exists. The traders believed they were free men. The mayors believed they ruled by reason. But the plan was still steering them, quietly, invisibly. Every trade route, every alliance, every crisis resolved exactly as Seldon had calculated. The Foundation was not governing itself, it was behaving itself, like a machine executing instructions from a past it could no longer question. And yet, history always hides the seeds of rebellion. The outer worlds began to whisper. They spoke of the Foundation not as saviors, but as tyrants disguised as merchants. Independence movements flared and died, their leaders vanishing into the silence of space. Seldon had foreseen this too. Each uprising, each political schism was simply another crisis, another funnel in the plan's narrowing corridor of probability. The holograms reappeared, centuries apart, to explain what had already happened. It became almost ritualistic. The vault would open, light would shimmer, and Hari Seldon's recorded voice would reassure them that everything was proceeding according to his predictions. The crowd would cheer, fear would dissolve, and history would continue down its rails. But not everyone found comfort in that voice. Some began to wonder whether they were participants or prisoners. Could free will exist in a universe where every major decision had already been accounted for? Could a civilization evolve if its destiny had been scripted centuries before? The more powerful the Foundation became, the more fragile it felt. Because the plan depended on ignorance. The moment too many people understood it, they could begin to break it. Seldon had hidden this flaw carefully. Psychohistory worked only when humans behaved as a statistical mass, not as informed individuals. Awareness of the plan would alter the probabilities. Knowledge itself could corrupt destiny. And so, even in the age of science, secrecy remained sacred. By the time the Foundation reached its peak, controlling trade across hundreds of systems, it had become what it was meant to replace: a bureaucracy, a hierarchy, a machine that mistook efficiency for wisdom. The galaxy was once again orbiting the same mistake. From Trantor's ashes, a new empire was forming. Only this one worshipped reason instead of gods. And like all empires before it, it believed it was eternal. But psychohistory had already written its next chapter, because every rise in the plan contains the seeds of its fall. And somewhere, beyond the Foundation's reach, something was stirring, something that no equation could predict. The age of traitors was ending. The age of uncertainty was about to begin. On the nights when Terminus went quiet, when even the planetary wind died and the stars seemed frozen in the black, the city light shimmered like neurons across a sleeping brain. From orbit, it looked small, a flicker of intellect in the emptiness of the galactic rim. But up close, it pulsed with tension. The Foundation had survived its first centuries. Now it wanted to rule them. The air smelled of ozone and ambition. Great towers of glass and steel rose where once there had been tents and surveyors' huts. The streets hummed with traders, administrators, data technicians, and priests, though the priests now called themselves public educators. The city had evolved, layer by layer, into something Hari Seldon could have predicted with eerie precision. Yet if you listened closely, there was a sound underneath it all, a quiet rhythm of unease, the sense that history was watching. Psychohistory had promised a 1,000-year plan to shorten the darkness between empires, but for the people living within it, the plan wasn't myth, it was daily life. The Foundation's citizens were raised on its logic: rationality over passion, order over chaos, statistics over superstition. And yet, the longer they obeyed the plan, the more it began to feel like superstition itself. Every generation that passed grew further from the raw clarity of Seldon's vision. What had begun as a desperate experiment had become a religion of reason, and like all religions, it demanded faith. There were philosophers in the Foundation who tried to reconcile this contradiction. One of them, a scholar named Jord Parma, once wrote, "We have replaced the gods with equations, and we pray to them with the same trembling hands." He wasn't wrong. The Foundation worshipped probability. It believed that the universe itself could be managed, its chaos tamed by intellect. But deep down, the citizens of Terminus still dreamed of freedom. They wanted to believe their choices mattered, that they could shape their future without permission from the ghost of a mathematician long dead. The paradox haunted them, and it still haunts us. Look at our world now: algorithms predicting elections, markets, even moods, predictive systems charting human behavior at scale. Hari Seldon's dream, once fiction, has become our architecture. Every data point we produce feeds a model that forecasts our next move. Every click, every purchase, every fear becomes part of a greater equation. Are we truly free, or are we following patterns we no longer control? In Seldon's time, psychohistory was a theoretical revolution. In ours, it's just a business model, but the logic remains the same. Human behavior, measured at scale, is predictable, and predictable behavior is manageable. The Foundation's traders once used nuclear gadgets to bind entire worlds into obedience. Today, corporations use algorithms, currencies, and attention. The mechanism changes. The mathematics does not. Maybe that's the point psychohistory was trying to make. Civilization isn't a story of good or evil. It's a system looking for equilibrium. When imbalance grows too great, collapse becomes the only kind of order left. On Terminus, this truth was both sacred and dangerous. To acknowledge it was to admit the future was fixed. To deny it was to risk breaking the plan. And yet, cracks began to appear. The traders who sailed between stars saw too much. They saw worlds suffering under the Foundation's gifts, priests manipulating belief in the name of progress, merchants profiting from dependence. They saw that the plan, while perfect on paper, was merciless in practice. It tolerated no deviation, no compassion, no chaos. To the Foundation's leaders, this was the price of survival. To the few who dared question it, it looked like the start of another empire, one blind to its own decay. Hari Seldon had predicted this too, in fragments. His holograms had warned that stability breeds stagnation, that the most dangerous moment for any civilization is not its decline, but its triumph, because that's when the plan stops being a guide and becomes a cage. Imagine living in a world where every crisis is anticipated, every solution already known, where every victory feels rehearsed. For generations, the Foundation's citizens had believed they were the authors of their destiny. But now they began to realize they were only actors in a play whose ending had been written centuries before. That realization changes a people. It drains meaning from ambition. It replaces hope with routine. And routine, when it hardens, becomes the slow death of imagination. So the Foundation, this marvel of reason and intellect, began to suffer the same sickness that once consumed Trantor. Not decay of buildings, but decay of purpose. The same bureaucracy, the same complacency, wrapped in cleaner logic. Perhaps this was the true insight of psychohistory, that no amount of calculation can erase the flaws in human nature, because the equations might describe our patterns, but they can't change what drives them: fear, pride, the hunger to be remembered. Sometimes when the night fell over Terminus and the stars scattered like shattered glass, young scientists would stand on the city's edge and whisper stories about the Second Foundation, the secret half of Seldon's design. They didn't know where it was. No one did. But rumor said it was watching, hidden somewhere at the star's end, guarding the plan against itself. It was a comforting myth, the idea that someone, somewhere, was keeping the math honest. But myths, as Seldon knew, are just another form of control. Still the whispers grew. They spoke of minds that could touch thought itself, mentalics who could sense emotion and guide it like a current, beings who didn't calculate history, but felt it. If psychohistory was the science of masses, the Second Foundation was the art of the mind. And one day, the two would collide. But on Terminus, no one could see that yet. They only saw progress, gleaming towers, efficient systems, a future that seemed stable, too stable, because stability is the final phase before collapse. Hari Seldon had always known that. He'd written it into the mathematics like a warning carved into the bones of time. Every era of peace is a prelude to disruption. Every balance invites imbalance. And somewhere in the spiral of history, the next crisis was already forming. A shadow no equation could quantify. The Foundation had mastered trade, faith, and reason, but it had forgotten the one variable that could not be modeled, the human heart. The citizens of Terminus had begun to forget that they were supposed to be afraid. That's how all civilizations end, not with panic, but with comfort. The old scientists who had once built the city were gone. The new generation had never known a world without the foundation. To them, it wasn't a miracle born from exile. It was simply how the universe worked. Salvor Hardin's statue stood in the central plaza, a monument of bronze so polished it reflected the sky. The inscription read, "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent." Children played around it without ever asking what the words meant. In one of the upper towers, Mayor Inber III sat at his desk surrounded by datapads. His office was silent except for the faint hum of atmospheric stabilizers. Reports from across the periphery poured in, economic data, trade disputes, religious uprisings, but he barely read them anymore. That was the problem. He had inherited a system that ran too perfectly. Bureaucrats obeyed equations, traders quoted Seldon like scripture, and citizens moved through life with mechanical precision. Predictability, Inber once told his aides, is the highest form of peace. But when you looked into his eyes, you saw a man quietly terrified of unpredictability. Across the city, a young historian named Beta Durrell worked in the archives. She loved the smell of old data chips, the faint chemical tang of static. She'd grown up hearing about the great days when the Foundation had battled the barbarian kingdoms, when knowledge itself had been a weapon. Now her days were spent cataloging treaties, trade ledgers, and communications, paperwork instead of history. One night, while restoring a damaged holorecord, she found a corrupted fragment that caught her attention. It wasn't labeled as part of the usual Seldon messages. It was older, distorted by time. The voice that emerged from the static was faint but unmistakable. The anomaly will not appear in the numbers. It will appear in the hearts that misread them. The voice paused, then whispered, "And when it does, the Foundation will forget what it was meant to preserve." The fragment ended abruptly. Bida sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the blank screen. She didn't know if what she'd found was real or some recording glitch, but the words left a quiet echo in her mind. That same night, a ship arrived from the outer systems, damaged, its crew shaken. They claimed to have encountered something impossible, a man who could bend loyalty with a glance, who could turn enemies into allies without words. They called him the Mule. No one believed them at first, but soon more reports came. Planets surrendering without battle, armies disbanding overnight, worlds falling under his control like dominoes, faster than any Seldon projection could explain. The equations didn't account for him. The next scheduled Seldon hologram appeared in the time vault right on schedule. The chamber filled with citizens, administrators, and priests, each expecting calm reassurance, the usual precise prediction of victory. The hologram shimmered to life. Hari Seldon's image smiled faintly, as it always did. "My friends," he began, "I appear before you at the dawn of your next crisis." But then something strange happened. The recording glitched. His image flickered. For a second, his expression changed, almost as if he sensed something he hadn't before. Then the message stabilized again, continuing with its usual certainty. No mention of the Mule, no adjustment, no warning. The officials applauded, relieved. "The plan holds," they said. "This too is part of it." But Beta felt a coldness in her chest. She had heard that fragment, the one that spoke of an anomaly the numbers couldn't see. And now it was here. The Mule's empire grew like a storm spreading through vacuum. Planets that had been loyal to the Foundation for generations defected overnight. Whole fleets switched allegiance without a shot fired. He didn't need force. He used something deeper, emotion. He could sense fear, twist loyalty, plant devotion where there had been doubt. No weapon could defend against that. For the first time in centuries, the Seldon plan was blind. In one of the captured systems, a Foundation commander wrote his last message before defecting. "He does not conquer," it read. "He listens." And somehow, when he listens, you want to follow him. The message ended mid-transmission. Beta joined a small group of scientists and traders trying to understand what was happening. Among them was a quiet man named Ebling Miss, a brilliant but unstable psychologist who had spent his life studying the Seldon equations. He believed the second foundation was real. "They'll save us," he said. "They were built for this." "Then where are they?" Beta asked. Miss had no answer, so they set out to find them. Across half a galaxy, through forgotten archives and dying stars, they followed fragments of myth. Coordinates that led nowhere, clues that contradicted themselves. The closer they got, the stranger things became. People they met would shift in mood, lose memory, fall into devotion to the mule without realizing it. It wasn't just conquest anymore, it was infection. As their ship crossed the edge of the periphery, Miss began to crack under the pressure. "Do you understand?" he whispered to Beta one night. "If the second foundation can't stop him, then the plan ends. Civilization ends." Beta stared at the stars through the viewport. Maybe the plan was never meant to last forever. But before Miss could answer, the lights flickered, and the ship's AI announced a boarding alert. A single vessel had approached without identification. It sent only one message. "I mean you no harm." The voice was calm, almost kind. When the door to the cabin opened, Beta saw a tall, thin man standing there. His face was ordinary. His eyes were not. He smiled gently. "You're looking for the second foundation," he said. "I'm afraid you won't find them in time." Her breath caught. "Who are you?" He tilted his head slightly. "They call me the Mule." The air between them felt heavy, electric. For a second, Beta wanted to trust him completely. She wanted to follow him, listen to him, believe. Then she realized what was happening, and the world of equations, probabilities, and carefully balanced centuries finally cracked. The plan was never supposed to break. That was the one promise, the sacred certainty whispered across centuries. And yet, somewhere in the dark, a single mutation was rewriting history. No one knew where he came from. Some said he was born on a forgotten fringe world. Others claimed he was the orphan of a war that had burned itself out before it began. His real name was lost, buried beneath myth and rumor. But one fact remained. He was not supposed to exist. The Mule rose not as a conqueror, but as a whisper, a rumor of a man who could not be resisted. Armies didn't fear him because he was powerful. They feared him because they loved him. Within months, half the periphery had fallen without a single decisive battle. Worlds turned themselves over willingly, as if compelled by a gravity stronger than loyalty. On Terminus, the mathematicians tried to fit him into the equations. The computers churned through terabytes of probabilities, searching for the pattern. But there was none. The numbers diverged wildly, collapsing into nonsense. Psychohistory depended on mass predictability. The Mule turned individuals into masses that moved like extensions of his will. He was the first true chaos in a system built on order. The Foundation's leaders refused to believe the plan could fail. Seldon predicted every crisis, they insisted. This too must be part of it. But as the Mule's fleet approached, the old confidence began to rot. The messages from the outer worlds came less often, then stopped entirely. The mayoral council met in secret. Some argued for surrender. Others demanded faith in Seldon's plan. "The holograms have never failed us," said Councillor Semlin. "They always appear with the answer when the moment is darkest." But this darkness was different. When the next scheduled Seldon recording appeared, it played as usual, Seldon smiling, calm, certain. "The current crisis," he said, "will resolve itself through the Foundation's mastery of trade and diplomacy." But outside the vault, trade routes were burning. The Mule had already taken 60 planets. Within a year, he would control 100. And soon, the Foundation itself would kneel. History remembers the Mule as a conqueror, but that's not quite right. He didn't conquer through war. He conquered through emotion. His mutation allowed him to sense and manipulate the feelings of others. Fear, loyalty, devotion, turning entire populations into extensions of himself. Empires had fallen before, but never like this. The Roman emperors had ruled through law, the Galactic emperors through bureaucracy. The mule ruled through love twisted into obedience. He became a mirror that reflected the deepest weakness of civilization, the hunger to belong to something absolute. From the ashes of rebellion, he built the union of worlds, declaring himself first citizen rather than emperor. The empire failed because it did not feel, he told his followers. We will not make that mistake. And they believed him. The irony was perfect. A man who controlled feelings led a galaxy that worshipped sincerity. In less than 5 years, the plan was undone. The balance between knowledge, religion, and trade, the pillars Seldon had built, collapsed under the weight of one man's will. The foundation was no longer a seed of renewal. It was a puppet regime orbiting a single mind. The equations in the vault, once sacred, became irrelevant relics. Psychohistory had predicted wars, rebellions, even centuries of stagnation, but it had never predicted a man who could make billions feel the same thing at once. The mule's power wasn't strength, it was empathy without ethics. Even in victory, though, something in him remained uneasy. He ruled over a galaxy that adored him, yet he felt only loneliness. The emotions he sensed from others were real, but their origins were not. They were his creation, reflections of his power, and that haunted him. For all his might, the mule couldn't control one thing, his own fate. Somewhere out there, he knew, the second foundation still existed. The hidden guardians of the plan, the telepaths who could think like he could, or perhaps even better. They were watching, waiting. He began to hunt them. Every world he conquered, he searched for whispers of their existence. Every archive, every record, every myth that mentioned Star's End. But the more he looked, the less he found. The second foundation had buried itself so deeply in secrecy that it had become invisible. His victories grew hollow. His empire stretched thin. And for the first time, the man who had conquered through emotion began to feel the one emotion he couldn't control: doubt. Because deep down, the mule feared the same thing Seldon once had, that even chaos follows a pattern. And maybe he, too, was just another variable in the plan. The galaxy watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. For centuries, people had believed the universe ran on mathematics and destiny. The mule proved that one mind could rewrite destiny by existing. He was the anomaly Seldon had warned about, the random mutation that no probability curve could contain. But what no one knew yet, not even him, was that the second foundation had already moved. They were not gone. They were guiding events invisibly, letting him think he'd won, because sometimes the surest way to preserve a plan is to let the anomaly think it has destroyed it. And in the silence between victories, as he sat alone aboard his flagship staring out at the swirling arms of the galaxy he now ruled, the mule whispered to himself, "If the plan can predict everything except me, then maybe I was the point all along." He almost believed it. Almost, but far away, on a hidden world that appeared on no map, someone else was already adjusting the numbers. The night skies of the mule's empire were unnaturally calm. Fleets glided in perfect synchrony. Cities that once pulsed with noise now moved with quiet precision. Every citizen slept soundly, their dreams shaped by a peace that felt too absolute to be real. It was the peace of control. On Calgon, the new capital, towers of gold and glass rose over warm oceans that shimmered under perpetual twilight. The mule had ordered the architects to design a city that reflected serenity. No jagged lines, no shadows, no corners where unrest could gather. From above, the city looked like a neural map, streets branching like dendrites, all leading back to the palace at its center, the brain of the empire. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and orchids. Silent servitors glided across marble floors. The mule stood at a high window, watching the tides crash against the shore. Every movement of the ocean felt like a reminder of what he couldn't predict. He could feel the emotions of every person on the planet: love, devotion, contentment, all tuned to him. But beneath that harmony, he sensed something else: emptiness. They were at peace because he willed it. They were happy because he demanded it. It was perfect, and yet it was meaningless. He whispered, "If I have created peace, why does it feel like silence before collapse?" This was the paradox of power that even Seldon's equations could never model. Empires believe they are strong when they can suppress chaos, when they can force order into the wild currents of human nature. But control is not stability, it is compression, and all compression ends with release. The mule began to wonder if he had become the very thing he once despised, a tyrant trapped by his own logic. His control over emotion had given him absolute dominion, but at the cost of unpredictability, of humanity itself. Even his most loyal advisors could no longer surprise him. When he looked at them, he saw not faces but waves of feeling, admiration, devotion, fear. He knew their next words before they spoke them. It was the curse of omniscience. In his private chambers, he often read the fragments of the Encyclopedia Galactica. He liked the way it spoke of things that no longer existed: curiosity, rebellion, the messy accidents of history. He envied the civilizations that could make mistakes, because mistakes were proof of freedom. He wondered if psychohistory had ever truly failed. Maybe Seldon's plan was never broken. Maybe it needed him. Maybe the anomaly was just another variable in a larger equation. But if that were true, what did that make him? Savior or pawn? In the heart of the galaxy, far beyond the mule's reach, the second foundation was asking the same question. Hidden minds, trained in the art of thought itself, studied his rise the way astronomers study a rogue comet. They called him the distortion. Their calculations showed that the Seldon curve had indeed fractured, but not shattered. There was still a way to bring it back on course. The question was how to correct the anomaly without destroying the galaxy in the process. To them, the mule wasn't evil. He was a symptom, a flare of consciousness in a system designed to suppress it. One of their leaders said quietly, "He is what happens when we mistake prediction for understanding." That line would echo through centuries. On Calgon, the mule began experiencing something new: interference. It came as static in his mind, faint disruptions in the emotional patterns he read so easily. For the first time, there were places, small, distant, where he could not feel the emotions of his subjects. The sensation frightened him. It was like blindness. He ordered his scientists to investigate psychic shielding, but deep down, he knew it wasn't technology. It was resistance. Minds strong enough to hide themselves from him. Minds that knew what he was, the second foundation, the unseen observers. He looked up at the stars one night and spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. "You think you're guiding me, but you've already lost. I've done what Seldon never could. I've made peace real." But the words felt hollow, because the peace he'd built was not born of understanding. It was built on compulsion. This was the philosophical core of his tragedy. He had mastered emotion, but lost meaning. His empire was flawless because no one inside it could choose otherwise. When viewed from orbit, Calgon shone like a jewel. But closer inspection revealed its cracks: laughter that stopped a beat too early, smiles that never quite reached the eyes, a stillness that felt like mourning. Even in his victory, the mule could sense what every ruler before him had ignored. Civilizations do not fall when their enemies destroy them. They fall when their people stop feeling real things. In this way, he had become the architect of his own decay. Modern parallels aren't hard to see. Replace psychic control with algorithms, replace emotional manipulation with data feeds, replace the mule's empire with our own systems of influence: political, digital, economic. We too live under the illusion of choice, our desires measured and modeled until spontaneity becomes a statistic. Like the citizens of Calgon, we are happy because the system tells us we are. Connected, yet unseen. Predictable, yet convinced of freedom. The mule's gift, the ability to sense and steer emotion, is now something we've handed to our own machines. Psychohistory was fiction. Predictive analytics is not. Perhaps that's why this story still feels like prophecy. As the mule's empire reached its zenith, the interference in his mind grew stronger. He began losing control over certain sectors. Entire worlds flickered out of emotional sync, as if his reach could no longer hold them. He sent fleets to restore order, but the rebellions were subtle, almost invisible. Acts of thought, not war. People simply stopped feeling the way he wanted them to. And he realized, too late, that the second foundation had found him first. Somewhere, hidden among the stars, the real battle had already begun. A war not of armies, but of minds. He pressed his hand against the window of his palace, feeling the faint tremor of a world that was beginning to wake up. "So," he whispered, "this is what freedom feels like." The tide of the galaxy was turning again, imperceptibly but inevitably. And for the first time in his life, the mule smiled. Not out of triumph, but out of something far rarer. Wonder. The wind on Calgon carried the scent of rain. Beta Daryl stood on the balcony of her assigned quarters, watching the horizon glow faintly with the energy of orbital traffic. The mule's banners hung from every tower, silver and white, unwrinkled, unstained, unmoved by the breeze. It looked like peace. It felt like anesthesia. She'd been brought here under the illusion of comfort. Her ship had been seized, her companions scattered. Ebling Miss was alive, barely, confined to the palace laboratories, muttering equations in his sleep. She suspected the mule wanted them close, not out of mercy but curiosity. He needed them the way a god needs an audience, to see if his power still impressed them. Every night, the lights of Calgon dimmed to simulate twilight. Every night, she felt the strange warmth of his influence pressing at the edge of her mind, soft, persuasive, impossible to ignore. Sometimes it felt like empathy, sometimes like gravity, and sometimes she caught herself wondering if maybe he truly was what the galaxy needed. When she was finally summoned, she expected a throne room of grandeur. Instead, the mule met her in a quiet study lined with books. He sat behind a simple desk, a dim lamp casting long shadows across the walls. "I didn't think you'd come," he said softly. His voice was gentle, too gentle. "I didn't have much choice," she replied. He smiled faintly. "Choice is relative." That's what Seldon never understood. Beta studied him. He didn't look like a conqueror. His face was drawn, pale, almost kind. The fatigue in his eyes was unmistakable. "I know what you're afraid of," he said after a pause. "You think I'm destroying the plan. But what if the plan was wrong? What if it wasn't?" she countered. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Tell me, Beta, has the plan ever loved anyone? Has it ever saved a life without weighing a cost first? I've done both." His words struck something inside her, not because they were true, but because they felt true. That was his gift, the ability to make emotion feel like revelation. She took a step closer. "You control people, not save them." "Control," he echoed. "Or connection." For a moment, the room seemed to pulse with warmth. She could feel his presence in her thoughts, brushing lightly, searching for fear. Instead, he found pity, and that surprised him. Ebling Mies was dying. The strain of his research had burned him out. They had allowed him access to restricted archives, desperate for any lead on the second foundation. For weeks, he worked without rest, drawing calculations on walls, muttering to himself. The second foundation. "It exists," he whispered to Beta during one of his lucid moments. "They're real. They're close. I know where they are." His hand trembled as he scribbled coordinates. "Star's End, the old word for the edge of the galaxy. But it's not a place. It's a metaphor." Beta leaned in. "Then where?" He looked at her, eyes wild. "Right here. Among us." They never left the center. They've been hiding in plain sight in the minds of men who believe themselves free. Before she could speak, the door opened. The mule stepped inside. Miss froze, his voice collapsing into silence. The air thickened. The mule's expression was unreadable. "You've found something," he said quietly. Miss tried to resist. His lips trembled. "I..." Beta saw it, the invisible tension, the war between will and compulsion. The mule didn't move, but his power pressed forward, threading into Miss's thoughts. "Tell me," he commanded. Miss screamed. The sound echoed through the room, raw and human. Then he fell silent. His breath slowed, his heart stopped. The mule stared at the body in shock. "I didn't mean to..." But Beta already knew. She had seen enough to understand what Seldon's fragment had warned. The anomaly would not appear in the numbers. It would appear in the hearts that misread them. She turned to him, trembling but resolute. "You'll never find the second foundation." He looked at her, confusion mixing with grief. "Why?" "Because they've already found you." For the first time, the mule's certainty faltered. His control over her flickered, then failed completely. It was like watching a god realize he'd been human all along. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Beta stepped closer. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "You feel everything, don't you? The love, the devotion. You think it's proof of your power, but don't you see? That's the weakness. You need it. You crave it." He shook his head. "You can't understand." "I do," she said. "That's why I can stop you." He froze. "Stop me?" "You can't." But before he could finish, Beta lifted the small pulse disruptor Miss had smuggled to her days earlier. "This isn't for you," she whispered. "It's for the plan." The device fired a silent burst. The mule didn't fall. He staggered, disoriented, his senses collapsing inward. Beta caught him as he fell to his knees. He looked up at her, eyes wide, almost pleading. "What have you done?" She touched his face gently. "Nothing you didn't already do to yourself." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him conscious but broken, his power still intact, but his faith in it gone. In the days that followed, his empire began to waver. Orders were ignored. Fleets hesitated. For the first time, his followers questioned him, not because they were freed, but because he no longer believed in his own control. Psychohistory began to realign itself. Slowly, imperceptibly, the Seldon curve bent back toward its original trajectory. The galaxy's chaos would be reduced once again to 1,000 years. But in a hidden archive beneath the ruins of Trantor, a new Seldon recording activated earlier than scheduled. The hologram flickered to life. Hari Seldon smiled faintly. "If you're watching this, the anomaly has been corrected, but not erased. It remains part of the curve, a permanent variable. The plan will continue, but it will never be the same, because once a system learns, it can be broken. It can never forget." The recording ended with a single line. "Beware the moment when minds become equations." In the shadows of the dying palace, the mule stood alone, staring into the rain. He could still feel millions of minds across the stars, but they no longer obeyed him. They were just out of reach, moving beyond his influence, like echoes fading into static. He whispered to the empty air, "Was I the savior or the test?" No voice answered. Only the sound of thunder rolling across the sea. It begins with silence, not the quiet of peace, but the breath before a storm no one can see. On Terminus, the stars gleam coldly over a world that once believed it was following a script written by the greatest mind in history. Yet somewhere between those stars, a new pattern has emerged, one no equation could predict. The Foundation has become an empire in all but name. Trade routes stretch like veins across the galaxy. Merchant princes rule systems once loyal to the core. Knowledge, once hidden behind priesthood and power, has turned into currency. And for a moment, just a flicker, it seems that Hari Seldon's plan is working. But every plan carries its flaw. Every formula hides a variable. Somewhere on a forgotten world, a man with no history and no family learns that he can make others love him. Not admire, not obey, love, with a devotion that corrodes reason. He has no name yet, only whispers, the mule. He does not conquer worlds, he bends them. One governor surrenders without a shot, overcome with faith. Another opens his own palace gates, tears streaming, begging to serve. Armies dissolve not from defeat, but from joy. The plan begins to shiver, unseen, beneath the weight of something it never predicted, emotion, because psychohistory could predict populations, not passions. It could foresee revolutions, but not revelation. Hari Seldon built a map of minds, not hearts, and the mule is a storm made of feeling. Across the galaxy, the first foundation feels the tremor. Traders vanish, alliances fracture. The glow of prosperity turns brittle. The Seldon crisis hologram appears, calm, confident, recorded centuries before, predicting that this would be a moment of triumph. His words echo in auditoriums as worlds burn outside. For the first time, the Foundation doubts its prophet. Fear spreads faster than fleets. On Haven, a minister wakes screaming from dreams that are not his own. On Calgon, citizens fill the streets chanting the name of a man they've never met. On Terminus, the great vault of psychohistorical predictions flickers, and for the first time shows nothing. The equations have gone blind, and then comes the rumor, the second foundation. A myth, a whisper of another group guarding the plan from the shadows. The search for them becomes desperate, the only hope left in a collapsing script, but the second foundation fears what it must face. Telepaths trained to guide destiny find themselves confronted by a mind that can reshape emotion itself. One of them writes, "The future feels wrong, as if joy itself has become a weapon. Every empire dies twice, once in the mind, once in the body. The first foundation's faith dies first. The mule's fleets move like ghosts. Systems fall in weeks. Science is replaced by loyalty. The plan, stretched across millennia, begins to crack under a single life. It was never supposed to hinge on one man, and yet here he is, smiling gently, as entire civilizations kneel. He takes Terminus without bloodshed. And for the first time since Trantor's fall, the galaxy unites, not under reason but under devotion. The Foundation becomes his temple, but devotion cannot be inherited. The mule grows older, haunted by the same flaw he exploited in others, love's fragility. His followers adore him, but he cannot pass that bond on. Psychohistory did not predict him because it could not imagine him. A singularity of emotion, burning too bright to last. When he dies, his empire will crumble overnight. Hari Seldon's 1,000-year dream will breathe again, scarred, delayed, but alive. Because the plan was never truly about predicting perfection. It was about surviving madness, and that is the lesson Trantor never learned. History isn't a straight line. It loops like a pulse. Each rise carries the seed of its fall, each collapse, the memory of what was. On worlds where the mule's banners once flew, traders return. On the rim, scientists reopen sealed archives. The second foundation moves quietly among them, erasing memories, mending fractures, reshaping the mind of the galaxy one thought at a time. Somewhere, a child on a distant colony looks up at the stars and wonders why she feels an ache she cannot name. The echo of all this history folded into her blood. And as the vault on Terminus glows once more, Seldon's face appears again, recorded centuries ago, smiling faintly. The plan endures, he says. It always endures. But the camera lingers not on his hologram. It drifts through the ruins of Trantor, now a silent planet of steel and dust, where vines have begun to grow through the cracks. And somewhere in that silence, another voice whispers, "Until the next empire forgets." The stars flare, the music fades, and the question remains, if every empire must fall, can even our own world escape the same fate?